Welcome to Kachi Bachi. We're going to be talking about sewing and quilting and embroidery and just anything of the like. Today I am going to just go over seam rippers with you and all the different types that there are and which ones are good for what type of seam ripping. So there's embroidery, and then there's quilting, and then there's sewing like straight seams and serger seams and everything in between. And so depending on what kind of seam I'm ripping, that will determine what seam ripper I reach for. So the main thing that most people will be ripping will just be a straight seam. So something that would be sewing two quilt blocks together or sewing like the seam on a garment, doing a repair, a hem, anything of the like. So the first thing we're going to go through is just the basics of how you use a seam ripper. So I have my favorite, and it's $4.75 at my local quilt shop, and it's from Clover, and this is what I typically go to. So we're going to identify the different parts on a seam ripper. You actually have the blade, which is farther down in this little yoke between the Y. You have the point, and then there's typically some sort of like a red ball or just a blunted end. So when I am seam ripping, I will typically pick myself a couple stitches at the beginning of my seam, and then I'm going to put the blunted edge or the red ball side down, and I will slide my seam ripper through my seam. And I can rip out a seam pretty quickly, as you can see. And this is, to me, the most efficient way. And then every now and again, I'll stop and clean out my seam ripper. And that's the basics of just how I go about using a seam ripper. Okay, so when it comes to purchasing a seam ripper then, if that's my main goal is being able to slide it through my seam like that, then the most important part of your seam ripper is going to be the blade. So that's going to be at the center of this yoke here. And then you have the point, and that's what I would use to pick out stitches, and then you have the little red ball. So to me, having a red ball or no red ball doesn't really make a massive difference. If you're doing like satins and stuff like that, then it might make a difference because it'll keep you from like putting a run in your material. And then having a thin point and having a thin yoke is actually what makes a really big difference for me. So there are, what's the brand? There are these rubber tipped ones that are great because they like have a little rubberized tip on the cap, and that allows you to pull the threads out after you've ripped your seam. So when I'm seam ripping, thankfully on one side, when you do it that way, you get like one long thread, and so it makes it a whole lot easier to pick off those threads because they're pretty long, at least on one side. So I personally don't really use that little rubbery ball. I will say it actually is great for chenilling. So that's a new thing that everybody's really back into because it's not new, it's a revived thing. And they make great chenilling fluffer brushes, or you can use the rubberized tip from the seam rippers. But those aren't great for running through your seam like that because they have a very thick blade. And so I find that I only get like 2 to 3 stitches in, and then it like jams up with my like 2 or 3 threads, and I can't keep going. So I'm constantly like having to pull it out, clean off my blade, and then put it back in. So I'm not super into those seam rippers, which is why I don't have one here to demo for you, because once it got lost, I wasn't keen to replace it. So there's that. So then there's like the big ones that have a big handle that make it a little easier. Personally, I find this is a decent size handle, well over the traditional one that's gonna come with most sewing machines. It's just like a generic little seam ripper here. And this one's decent. I mean, it's not a bad seam ripper. It's just not the greatest. So that's why they come free with your sewing machines. They're not gonna like include the most expensive tool on the market. It does the job. If it's what I have in my sewing kit when I'm going to and from class, that's great. Personally, I keep like 2 or 3 of these, and as a general rule, I replace them on my birthday every year because your blade gets dull. And I mean, blades dull from use, and I use my seam ripper because I make mistakes. So it's something like if you make it a habit of replacing on your birthday, then it's a great birthday present to yourself for like $4. Who doesn't love that? And I always have a sharp seam ripper, and on top of that, I always have a seam ripper because they are constantly getting lost or getting left in classes or in the bottom of a bag somewhere. And so it's always good to have multiple on hand. So this is my favorite for economy reasons because they constantly get lost. I don't get heartbroken. It's comparable, in my opinion, to the gold brass seam rippers that have a lifetime warranty, which are beautiful, and I mean, who wouldn't love that? But at the same time, it's a bit impractical, at least for my lifestyle, because I have a hard time keeping track of my seam rippers. And so I would possibly do a better job keeping up with it if I had a $25 brass seam ripper, but it hasn't been worth the investment. And because I do know that blades stall, I mean, I don't want to have to send off my favorite seam ripper every like 2 to 3 years for $5 and $10 to have it sharpened and then sent back to me. So I personally don't find a massive amount of value in investing in those. They're wonderful seam rippers. They will absolutely do the best of seam ripping, but so does my like $5 seam ripper. So that's just my personal opinion. Outside of that range, there's the seam rippers with magnifying glasses and the seam rippers with lights on them and all these fancy like doohickeys that can make your life supposedly easier. I have not found that to be the case. Personally, when I'm seam ripping, if my seam ripper is attached to my magnifying glass, then when I'm moving my seam ripper, my magnifying glass is moving, and that's rather inconvenient. So I'd rather a stationary or the thumb-mounted magnifying glass so that I can then rip without my magnifying glass constantly moving. So, yeah. $5, get yourself a seam ripper, or you can invest in whatever you find valuable from there. I mean, Frances is all about you doing you. So if that makes you happy, that makes her happy. So then that's just a basic seam if I'm doing any average everyday. For me personally, it's primarily quilting, so those are like why I lean towards this seam ripper. Then you have serge seams, and I would probably not use this seam ripper on a serge seam because that would be miserable. So when it comes to a serger, you've got like a minimum of 3 threads that are looped around and stitched into the edge of your garment or your project. And so for that, absolutely a blade or a surgical seam ripper is the way to go because you'll drive yourself crazy sitting there trying to pick things out with a traditional seam ripper. So just, it almost looks like an X-Acto knife, but it's a surgical scalpel blade, and those are invaluable when it comes to seam ripping a serger seam. And then embroidery, it would be the same tool if you're using like to snip out machine embroidery. You're not going to do it with a traditional seam ripper. That is miserable. You have to just go carefully with a surgical seam ripper or just a razor blade. So if you're using razor blades, not only can you use those with embroidery and serging, but I also use those when I have to rip out quilting. So from time to time, I've been known to have to take out some quilting stitches. It happens. And if I'm taking out like, let's say a half a row or a row of quilting because my tension got off, I don't want to use a regular seam ripper to do that. So I use just a straight blade, and I will peel back both the quilt top and the batting up to the stitch, and then just use my blade to slice through those stitches. It's a tedious process, but it is less tedious than my seam ripper, and it definitely is faster, like so much faster. They make electric seam rippers, and that would be their intended use as well. I have one because I was curious, and I can't say that I use it for seam ripping at all. It's too, it's not delicate enough. So I find that when I'm going between those layers, and I have my quilt top and my quilt back or batting, and I'm trying to rip between them, it is far more likely to end up nicking my quilt back than I am satisfied with. So when I did use it, even as slow as I possibly could go, I still found myself getting little holes into my backing. So because of this, I personally would rather use a razor blade. I find I have more control over every single stitch, and I don't wind up with little micro holes in the back of my quilt or back of my project. Not to mention paying like $25, $35 for a wall mustache trimmer with a sticker over it. And why don't you just go buy a mustache trimmer, or why don't you just not buy one at all? But that's personal preference there. So yeah, that is the basics of seam ripping, and you can now make yourself an informed decision when purchasing, and you can find what the best value is for you, what the best product is for you, based on what it is that you need to rip out. And I hope this was helpful and informative, and that you enjoyed your time with us today. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. We had a ton of fun just going over seam rippers and talking about how to rip a seam, the different types, and just what my favorite seam ripper is and why. If you have any other questions or just want to let us know what your favorite seam ripper is, drop us a line in the comments. We'd be happy to find out and learn some new things myself. So if you like this video, hit like, subscribe if you want to see some more, and follow us on Instagram or Facebook. We will be making more of these videos soon. So thank you again. Happy sewing and happy seam ripping.
Yeah!
Yeah? You like Mama's note?